Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, episode 203.
To answer your question, I do think that people generally tend to lean on what's already out there and available. And if they can't step outside the box, or if they're unwilling to step outside the box in order to come and approach a problem with a new angle, that tends to limit their capabilities in solving the problem.
Wireless LAN Professionals is a place to educate, inform, encourage, and entertain those involved in wireless LANs. This Wireless LAN Professionals podcast is an audio manifestation of these goals. Our host is a wireless LAN veteran, consultant, designer, and teacher, Keith Parsons. And now, the podcast for Wireless LAN Professionals by Wireless LAN Professionals.
Well, Rick, thank you for being here. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing good. Yes. It's nice and warm here in Arizona, but I am doing good.
Yeah, up here in Washington, we've got some rain coming and hanging around this weekend. We had some beautiful weather before, but it's definitely made a change.
So for those who don't know you, Rick, introduce yourself. What do you do in Wi-Fi, and what are you up to these days?
Absolutely. Well, I go by the name Rick. My actual name is Richard Steiner. I work for a small VAR out of Seattle, Washington called AeroPath Incorporated. We are primarily a professional services organization. We deal with pretty much anything Wi-Fi, but we are also primarily a Cisco VAR. So that encompasses both the Cisco Enterprise line as well as the Meraki line. We also have done Mist and Aruba deployments. We travel all over the world performing site surveys, AP on a stick surveys, troubleshooting, pretty much encompassing all types and manners of Wi-Fi professional services from that standpoint. We also have gotten into some point-to-point links and point-to-multipoint links and things like that for some of our more hardcore wireless clients. But that's pretty much what I do. My official title is Senior Systems Engineer, but realistically, I am the subject matter expert on the payroll, so pretty much cover just about anything wireless related. It comes to me.
And how did you get your start or find your way here?
Well, I actually started a long time ago in the service. I entered in the Army in 1990.
Okay.
And it was a newer military occupational specialty, or MOS, that was brought out of the need for doing things like telephone switching out in the field. And so they started with this program where they took some off-the-shelf equipment and put it together in a new way and basically created a mobile telephone switching operations scenario. And I did that for a while. Mostly it was just programming the phone switches, but we also had some SHF and UHF radio shots, so I had to learn radio propagation and that type of stuff. After I left the service, I entered into my cabling phase, and so I spent several years as a cable installer, whether it was Cat 5, Cat 6, fiber optics, that kind of thing. And that kind of just started everything down the road from that standpoint, and then kind of got a little bored with the cabling side. And so I ended up moving into wireless probably about, 18 years ago, and have basically worked with the guys that I'm working with now in different capacities, because AeroPath has actually bounced around a few times and changed hands, quote unquote, or changed names a couple times. But I've worked with these guys for probably, about 10 or 15 years of that time frame. So yeah, so that's basically it. And I've been a Cisco VAR for pretty much forever. We did make a change over to Aruba, so I started, getting all of the certifications and things of that nature from the manufacturers, and then started down the CWNP course track.
I was going to ask you what your path in that versus your Cisco cert path.
Yeah. So as far as like my CWNP, probably about 10 years ago, I was turned on to CWNP by my current CEO, Brad King. Okay. And he basically said, this is really good vendor agnostic kind of certification. And it really delved into it. Now, I obtained my CWNE a couple years ago. I am CWNE number 234. So, from that standpoint, went through all the CWNP certs, and I actually enjoyed the CWNP program a lot better than I do the manufacturer programs, only from the standpoint of it's more vendor agnostic, and it seems like it's more generalized information across a broad range of subjects.
Absolutely. What about your Cisco cert path? Where do you land in that?
Well, I've kind of bounced around. I've been a CCNA for many, many years. But I've done like the CCNA wireless. I've gone down the security path. I've been toying with the idea of going to the CCIE. I'm a little hesitant to do that, or have been hesitant to do that here in the last couple of years, only because of the fact that they were changing the program so much that I didn't want to get stuck into a situation where I was studying for one thing and then finding out that that wasn't something that I needed. So now that they've sort of settled that out, I may pick that mantle up again. As far as like Aruba is concerned, I've been through the Aruba path. I'm currently in ACDX number 128. I never went to the ACMX level, but I did go through the professional level back in the day when before Aruba was HPE. And I'm up actually this year for my ACDX research. So I need to get that done. So anyway, I'm all over as far as that goes. I'm also I guess they call it the Mist Master. I'm one of those people as well. So
that's great.
Got a lot of certifications. It seems to be the classic way of doing things in the IT world.
Well, from your presentation, it comes across that you are always a learner and always diving in and problem solving. One of the things that really stood out to me in your presentation is kind of the creative problem solving. At WLPC, you talked about a specific thing, and we'll get more into that, but you had these 3 steps to creative problem solving: assess, learn, and emulate. And we can talk about how you appropriated that with the specific issue. But tell me a little bit about that process and those, where did that come from, and just kind of your approach to problem solving?
Being at the subject matter expert for an organization, and, even though we're a small organization, most of my learning that I've done has actually been trial by fire. The organizations that I've worked for, they've generally have been the salespeople, and this is going to sound bad, but I'm going to say it anyway. The salespeople will generally sit there and nod their head and saying, yes, we can do that, and to the customer, and then they turn around to us and go, okay, how are we going to do this? So being in that situation more than once has lended itself to a very broad range of knowledge and definitely a broad range and broad spectrum of capabilities. And so plus I like to tinker with things. I like to kind of work with things. I'm a big advocate of open source projects because it's fun to get inside the program and things like that. So realistically, to me, learning is an everlasting process. It's something that you need to continually do. And I'm hoping that I'll be learning up until the day I die, because, the minute I stop and the minute my brain will stop functioning is basically my mindset on that.
Yeah.
And I'm always willing to try new things, even if I don't know anything about it, because in order to have a success, you have to have challenges and obstacles that you've been able to overcome throughout the path and the journey. And I tend to get bored once I hit the end of the journey and I'm going, that's it. So then it's off to something new, and moving on to something different. So
you were talking about emulating, not reinventing the wheel when you're problem solving. Do you think that's a hang up for people to always feel like they have to reinvent the wheel? Did you have to get over that in your own thinking at times?
To answer your question, I do think that people generally tend to lean on what's already out there and available. And if they can't step outside the box, or if they're unwilling to step outside the box in order to come and approach a problem with a new angle, that tends to limit their capabilities in solving the problem. And I do think that, granted, out of the box thinking is something that has to be developed, I think. But by the same token, in the box solutions, if it's already developed, sometimes, if you don't have to reinvent the wheel, don't do it. But if it's something that you kind of have no other choice based on the parameters that are being presented to you in any given situation, going and thinking outside the box, if you consider, back in the 80s, there was a show called MacGyver, and it's just been rebooted earlier here a couple of years ago. But I used to love that show. And the reason being is because he came up with creative solutions based upon what he was looking at and the situation that he was in. And it was more of use what's available to you rather than going out and trying to solve a problem with something that you may not be able to obtain. And so, that I've kind of applied that same thing to my thinking, and that's everything in everyday life.
So specifically, you shared a story at WLPC, and this particular problem was how you solved a driving MOS for VO Wi-Fi with Ekahau Pro and the WLAN Pi. So talk us through that story.
Okay, so obviously, again, I've gained, at least with the guys that I've worked with for many years, I've gained a reputation for coming up with solutions when there doesn't appear to be any. And so in this particular case, my CEO came to me and he pretty much said, hey, I've got a customer who is asking for us to prove that their voice over Wi-Fi is ready for them to turn on the switch to start handling, voice over Wi-Fi clients and stuff. How are we going to be able to do that utilizing the tools that we already have? And of course, putting on his salesmanship hat, he's like, oh, and by the way, I already bid this for X dollars. So there's nothing else that we can really add to the project. And so from that standpoint, I had to sit down and kind of I looked at him and I said, yep, we can do that. I know we can do that. And then internally, I looked back on myself and I went, okay, how am I going to do this? So one of the biggest things that I think really plays into situations like this is being able to do research and digging through clues that other people might have already come across and have put out there. The internet's a great thing. You can search it really easily. So one of the things that I did is I wanted to do my research. First of all, I had to understand what the MOS score was and how does it come about? How is it derived? From that standpoint, that led me to an article that was published by Panos of NetBees. Yeah. And I'm not even going to try and mention his full name or his last name because I'm sure I'm going to mincemeat it. But I ran across an article, a little blog post that he wrote on how NetBees, which is the monitoring system, derives MOS. And so in looking at that, I figured, well, shoot, if that's the way they're doing it. And he explained it explicitly in the article. He explained what the calculations were, where they go and get them, and how those calculations are put together. And so in my research, I basically said, well, if that's what they're going to do, then shoot, works for them, might as well work for me.
Well, and it's also a great case reminder to share knowledge. If you come across something or you know how to solve something, it's always worth putting it out there, either in a blog or sharing it somehow.
Oh, absolutely. And this community is fantastic for that. Just think of everything, everything that's being presented both at WLPC, it's engineers speaking to engineers, and all the way to projects like the WLAN Pi as an example. Everything is just sharing knowledge and understanding. It's an incredible community to be a part of. I feel very honored and blessed to actually even be allowed to sit in the room with some of these people.
So you found Panos's article. He explained it. You then could appropriate that, I guess, in your specific situation.
Well, yeah, absolutely. His article explained the calculations and in particular what needed to be used in order to create those calculations. And so essentially, I just basically copied from him. I pretty much plagiarized everything that he did as far as the calculations are concerned. But then I had to figure out, okay, so I know the calculations. I know what I'm looking for in terms of the metrics that I need to use to put into these calculations to be able to derive this score. Now it's how do I gather that data? How do I gather what's necessary? And in the presentation that I gave, the couple things that have to happen is you have to have packet loss, you have to have jitter, and you have to have latency. And all of these numerical values need to go into the MOS score, and they're used in different ways. His blog post explained how they use it. But the reality is that I didn't understand that. So I had to sit and figure out, how do I collect that data? And this is where, again, like I said, I'm a fan of open source. So open source availability, I already had a WLAN Pi in my hand. And I knew the WLAN PI could do things like using iPerf2 or iPerf3 in order to achieve a latency number. It can also do jitter based on using a UDP testing. So I pretty much knew that already. Plus, it's also a good endpoint to grab ping in order to get packet loss throughout the network. Because when you're doing packet loss and you're doing something across a network, especially in Wi-Fi, you don't necessarily want to ping something like a switch or a router. Because if you do that, the ping by itself, by its very nature, is at the low end of the totem pole in terms of what the priority is for that device to respond to it. So when you're trying to test Wi-Fi, you never really want to ping your gateway because your gateway has other things that it needs to be doing, like routing, as an example, that make it sometimes where it can give you false results. And so utilizing like just the gateway by itself was a bit of a problem. And so I had to come up with a way to have a device on the network. And because this particular site was in New York, so I was flying there, I had to carry something small enough that it could just, fit in my backpack. And the WLAN PI fit perfectly. Does all three things. It allows me to use a known endpoint on the network, and it was just perfect.
That's great. So where did you go from there?
Okay, so the next question that I had is, all right, so I've got the data, I've got the endpoint to utilize. Now, how am I going to be able to visualize that or provide a visualization of that to my client? Because, I could gather all this data manually and throw it into like an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, but that's going to take a while. So what is it that I can use that is already set up to provide some of that information? And turns out Ekahau Pro, Ekahau Pro Active Survey. It can gather, a couple of these things at the same time. And in this particular case, latency and jitter from the throughput testing. And unfortunately, Ekahau can't do both. It cannot ping and do a throughput test. You have a choice of either one or the other. And so the harder part was trying to figure out, okay, which one is going to be more important when it comes to the visualization? Which one's going to be the more important piece to be able to show this to my clients? Mm-hmm. And so I chose the throughput option on the Ekahau to be able to gather the latency and the jitter statistics. And then just for the packet loss, I just basically took my same laptop that I was doing the survey with and just pinged the WLAN PI and wrote that off to a file so that I could evaluate it later, look for things like large gaps in ping loss rather than just like an overall percentage or whatever from that kind of thing. And I also had to collect it in the time that I was given, because if you remember when we started the discussion, I'm only given, by the way, I've already quoted this for a certain amount of time, so we can't add a whole bunch of time to this thing. So anyway, so that was how I decided to go ahead and collect the data so that I could put it all together into a report and make it look good.
Well, you had mentioned in your talk about the continuous option, which was a little controversial, or you had been told not to do that. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so one of the challenges that you have with doing a test like this is the fact that inherently roaming can give you a bit of a problem, especially if the client device takes too long to actually roam. Now, granted, understanding, that people are going to be holding their, cell phone or voice over Wi-Fi phone, whatever device they're actually using, and they're going to walk through the area anyway. So standing still in one spot and doing like a stop and go survey, which you're not supposed to move during a stop and go survey. So standing there in one spot and doing throughput tests, which would be more ideal in the situation if you're looking at just throughput. Mm-hmm. So understanding that the clients are not going to necessarily stand still, that they're actually going to start walking and talking. I also wanted to incorporate the idea of, survivability across a roam. That being said, that's not necessarily the recommended way to gather throughput data because, impacting throughput is going to be impacted by the roaming process and, moving away from the first AP that you're connected to, and then the disconnect from that AP, the connection to the new AP, all of those processes during the reassociation and everything else is going to impact your throughput. So realistically, looking back on it, could I have done it differently? Yeah, maybe somebody else could come up with a better way of doing it. But the thing that I was trying to prove was the fact that no matter what happens, whether your client is roaming, whether your person's walking around, you're going to get a decent quality MOS score across this space. And so in order to do that, I had to get as close to emulating the actual situation as possible.
So you gathered the data, then what?
Okay. Looking at the data, once I had the numbers, now I've got to run them through the whole manual process of going through the entire calculation to come up with the final MOS score. If you read Panos's blog post, there's actually like 3 steps to it. The first step, you've got to create what is considered the effective latency. So in order to do that, you need to combine your latency and your jitter together. In the NetBees option, what they do is they add or they multiply jitter by 2 because of the fact that jitter is a really big impact to a voice situation, because UDP packets are sent, they're basically sent, send it and forget it. There's no, it's a connectionless protocol, so there's no confirmation that a packet has actually reached the end server or not. Now, when you do that over a Wi-Fi network, Wi-Fi has its own inherent checks and balances, sort of like TCP is. But with UDP across the entire link, you're actually not going to get that confirmation, that acknowledgement from the other end that you've actually got it. So having more jitter, which basically means that packets are arriving out of order or it's taking too long for a packet to arrive in the proper order, that kind of thing. If you have a large number of jitter, it becomes hard to follow the conversation, because if the packets don't arrive right, the sound quality is horrible. So what NetBees does is they go ahead and they use that jitter value, they double it, and then add it to the latency in order to get an effective jitter number. And then they also, as a part of that, they add a 10 millisecond time frame in order to account for things like delays in codec encoding and decoding. So once you do that, that gets you to your effective latency number. Now, there's a couple different models that you can use for voice over Wi-Fi evaluations. The one that's most commonly used, I found through research, is called the E model, and that's actually the same model that NetBees uses.
Okay.
So the E model basically gives a rating, or what's called an R value, to the quality of the communication. And this R value, they found the best quality has to be at least a 93.2 R value. So from that standpoint, that's the target that we're trying to get. We're trying to look at that R value. We're trying to get to 93.2 for that R value. So we start off with the effective latency. We figure that out. Then there's 2 different calculations that are done. This is step 2. So 2 different calculations that are done. If the effective latency is greater than 160 milliseconds, then you use a separate, different calculation than what you do if the effective latency is over 160 milliseconds. And then essentially both of those are subtracted in the effective latency calculation with the 160 milliseconds is actually divided by 40. So effective latency divided by 40, and then that value subtracted from 93.2. In the other calculation where it's greater than 160 milliseconds, there's some additional numbers added on. And so what you do there is you take your effective latency, you subtract 120 out of it, take that value, divide that by 10, and then subtract that number from 93.2. Because keep in mind, latency and jitter are your 2 big numbers in this. Because again, if the packets take too long to reach there, or if they arrive out of order, that's going to be murder on the quality of the call. So once we go through step 2, then we have to add in, so we've looked at effective latency, and as a part of that, we've included jitter. So our last value that we're going to look at is packet loss. So at that point, we take the R value, or the value that we had from before, and we subtract a 2.5 times the packet loss value. And that gives us essentially a R value, an R rating.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And of course, we can link to this where people can see visuals. So I'll get a link to Panos's blog and then to your presentation as well. So if someone wants to kind of see it as they're hearing it, we'll definitely connect them to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So then the last piece of the puzzle is dependent upon that R value that you've derived out of those 3 previous steps. So if that R value comes out to be less than 0, your MOS score is a 1, which is absolutely the worst. If that value falls between 0 and 100, then you do this calculation, and it's got, a bunch of numbers. I'm not going to walk through the whole thing. Look at the presentation to get it. But you do this calculation on it, and you derive your MOS score. If the R value, the number that you've brought from those 3 previous steps, is greater than 100, then it's automatically assigned a MOS score of 4.5. Now, even though MOS is technically 1 through 5, 4.5 is actually the highest number that you can actually get utilizing. I'm trying to remember the codec number. Don't remember it right off the top of my head, but it's in the blog. But there's a specific codec. I think it's the G7.11 codec. So the highest value that you can get is 4.5. Now, keep in mind, if you're using some different codec, you could come up with some different values, different calculations in order to do it. But the G7.11 one, I believe, is one of the most common that's used. And so because of that, that's kind of why I wanted to lean on this particular methodology in order to come up with the MOS score.
So what did you end up producing then for the client? Did it come out the way you had hoped, and were they pleased with the end result?
To be honest with you, half the time, I don't even know if they're pleased or not. I just sort of hand the report over and I never hear from them again if anything is good.
That's probably a good thing.
So, that kind of stinks in a way. Either that or all of a sudden we'll just start getting a whole bunch of more work from them.
Yeah.
One or the other, which is basically, my validation that, hey, what I did was good. Yay.
I'm back.
Yeah. But from that standpoint, what I did at that point is I said, okay, well, first of all, they're going to want to see signal strength. They're definitely going to want to see the signal strength across the entire space. The next thing that I wanted to show them was some visualization or some way to sort of show them in kind of a pass or fail format. In this case, red or green, because that's what Ekahau does.
Yeah.
The jitter visualization. So because jitter was the only one that actually gives me a map with the cover, both red and green, I pretty much incorporated those visualizations out of Ekahau as a part of the report. Realistically, throughout most of the facility, the jitter visualizations actually showed that jitter was good across, a good 95%. It was only a couple places. This was a retail outlet, so there was only a couple places in some of the stock rooms that they didn't have an AP close by that caused the jitter to go down, or go up, I should say. Caused the jitter to go up and get really bad. So from that standpoint, that was expected. And then what I went ahead and did is I provided a written explanation of everything that I've just told you. So all of, what the MOS actually is, how I derived it. And then I showed them a final table that basically gave a low, a medium, and a high across the entire floor. And most of the cases, it was pretty close. It was like between 4.0 and 4.5 for the most cases. There wasn't any place that I can think of right off the top of my head that actually went below a 4.0. So it pretty much basically showed them that the entire area that they were asking us to validate came out as being ready for voice over Wi-Fi.
Very cool. Did any of this translate into other jobs you've done since solving this? Have you utilized this anywhere else?
Yeah, actually, just this last fall, I think, it wasn't for voice over Wi-Fi, but we did have a couple of clients that popped up and said, hey, can you guys do like a throughput evaluation? Can you guys go through and evaluate the throughput across, in this case, this was a university, so across our outdoor space and our campuses? And so I was able to pull out my WLAN Pis. I've got 8 of the suckers today, but I was able to pull out the WLAN Pis, outfit a couple of my guys with them, and get them up on their network and just said, have at it and go through and do the throughput. Most people look at, they look at signal strength and they think signal strength is awesome. We're good. But that only tells one aspect of the story. There are so many other metrics that can be gathered. But more often than not, people are not necessarily willing, or they're not aware of these other metrics and what these impacts actually are. So more often than not, our clients will just say, hey, just do me a single signal validation and call it good. And so oftentimes I'll sit there and I'm just like, okay, signal validation is great. You have to have layer 1. You have to have signal, but that doesn't give you the entire picture. So being able to break out a tool like the WLAN Pi and doing an active survey versus a passive survey. That part actually kind of fascinates me because, again, we don't get an often chance to do it on a regular basis, but on the times that we do, it was really kind of cool, first of all, to do the voice over Wi-Fi because we don't do that a lot. I actually wish that I had that capability. This was, several years ago before the WLAN Pi even came out. I wish I had had that capability back then, but it turns out that, now that I've got it, I'm going to use it again. I'm definitely going to use it again.
Well, Rick, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for kind of doing a deeper dive on your presentation and giving us a few different angles and perspective, but really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Wireless LAN Professionals podcast, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Wireless LAN Pros for all the latest news and updates, and also connect directly with Keith on Twitter at Keith R. Parsons. Head over to www.wlanpros.com for this episode's show notes, as well as the latest in all things Wi-Fi.